The word bheda means two. So it refers to an experience of there being more than one. So there's you and me and some stuff and some animals and clouds and chocolate. There's way more than two. There's way more than an experience of two. So that's bheda, means two. So if we want to talk about experience in terms of two or not two, then we're using the words abheda and bheda. In Sanskrit, when you put a in front of a word, it means not. The experience of unity or unison, or what's sometimes called non-duality, is called abheda. And the experience of duality and non-duality, or the multiplicity and the one together, is called bhedabheda. It means two, not two. And then the experience of the dualistic experience is called bheda, just two. Now we can talk about those three categories of experience that are outlined in the source text of Trikashaivism. We can talk about them in terms of what kind of experience you are having, and what basically amounts to how subtly you're perceiving the nature of reality. So for instance, there's some people who are just utterly convinced and embody the experience that there is no fundamental unity between anything, and that everything here is separate bodies in space. So those people are literally having a dualistic experience. I don't know if you've seen the new sci-fi series on Hulu called Devs, but the main sort of evil guy is a dyed-in-the-wool dualist. And that's one of the things that makes him so evil. Sada thinks he's also got redeeming. He is sorrowful about his evil deeds, but I'm sorry, that's just not good enough, because he keeps doing them even while he's like, consoling himself with his guilt. Anyway, he has this very rationalist, scientific, materialist view of the world, kind of exemplifying bheda. And then, bheda. And then you could say that if someone was having experience of bheda, it means that they're having an experience of there being many things that are part of a unity. There's still a dualistic experience, but there's also an experience of unity. And then you could say that someone is being more in touch with non-dual experience. They're immersed in an experience of continuity or unison or unity. This is all based on an individual's experience. And this is often the way you'll see these terms talked about in Trika texts. But there's another way that those terms can be talked about and are talked about when we talk about them as forms of experience that are made of God and are being experienced by God. So in that sense, instead of being an aspect of our limitation, for instance, if we're only having dualistic experience, we don't sense any continuity here, that's a limitation on our experience that we're doing spiritual practice to try to erode that limitation. But if we're talking from the perspective of God, or the perspective of the ultimate reality or the absolute, all of those are forms of play. So dualistic experience is a form of play. It is being produced by God. And the bheda is being produced by God. And the experience of non-duality is also being produced. So some people would say, well, non-duality is the fundamental nature of reality, but the fundamental nature of reality is everything. It's all of those experiences as a form of play. And the actual nature of reality is wisdom. So this is, in a sense, why one of the founders of this tradition, Abhinavagupta, kind of invented an extra tattva, an extra layer of reality called Paramashiva, that where all bets are off and all definitions are off. And this is a way of trying to point towards this pure wisdom for which these terms are not important. But from our perspective, it's useful to understand are we really buying into and embodying the conviction that we're separate? Are we experiencing loneliness? And are we experiencing defensiveness? That kind of a thing, or is all a result of dualistic experience? Or do we have some sense of an underlying unity, but we're still experiencing things as separate? Or do we have the experience that everything is existing as one continuity? It's useful to have those categories just to talk about our own experience, but we shouldn't get too exercised about it. Because basically they're just the form of play. They're the different forms of play that this reality engages in. There's a beautiful line that I often quote from the Maharashtrian poet Gyanadeva. He was also a great Siddha and wrote a wonderful commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, this is from a different book that he wrote when he was in his early 20s, which always amazes me. But he says, once you have the experience of awakening, he says, then you come back, you return to play in the courtyard of duality. And what he means by that is if you're in a courtyard, you're in a liminal space. You're in an in-between space. You're not fully buying into duality as like the real thing, but you're playing in the courtyard of duality. So that experience of there being more than one becomes a form of play, just like satsang, where we get together and we get to experience conversation and call and response in the form of questions and answers. This is a space in the courtyard of duality too. So it's important to understand that you'll read in a lot of the texts of Trikashaivism, especially the later texts, bheda, bhedabheda, and abheda are talked about as, the ultimate experience is abheda and the degraded experience is bheda, something like that. There's almost like a sense of these things are just seen from the perspective of an individual. But when we look at it from the perspective of all of reality, of the ultimate, of the absolute, they're all forms of play, and none of them are degraded. They're all made of that absolute awake awareness and livingness.
The courtyard of duality, is there some sense they're not going all the way into it?
That's what I was just trying to articulate, which is that there's two ways to relate to duality. One is, hey, this is the way things are. I'm separate. You're separate, and don't bother me. Don't bug me. Don't hurt me. And then there's, hey, isn't this fun? I know we're all just one subjectivity, and everything here is wisdom. But hey, I like having this experience of talking to another. And we can get very attached to these terms. We should learn from them, but not be too attached to them. They're useful, they're functional for a time. And I always reference the introductory conversation in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, where Bhairava and Bhairavi are having a conversation. And Bhairavi is asking Bhairava, these are the fierce forms of Lord Shiva, what about the tattvas and what about the bheda, abheda? I mean, that's not really what she says, but she's asking about all these specific concepts and numbers of things in the tradition, all the apparatus that we use to understand things when we are a little bit shy of direct understanding. And Bhairava says to her, I'll answer your questions, but these things are just for babies. They're for immature people. They're for people who haven't realized. And he says they're really of no importance and they're all fraud. But it's kind of a sly commentary because he's basically saying they're useful fraud. They're functional fraud because we need these concepts. They're kind of the ladder or the ground that we traverse to get to the place where we're simply immersed in living awareness and we don't need any words for it or any concepts for it. But he then goes on to elucidate all the concepts and the practices by which one can eventually grow out of them.
Shambhavi, does that mean that there's no fundamental difference between relative and absolute?
Absolutely. Bingo. It's only from the experience of separation that it seems like there's any difference. So while we are still having an experience of separation, then to talk about relative and absolute is useful. I find it very useful to talk about things from our perspective, or in general our perspective, versus the perspective of God. That's the absolute. What does it look like from the perspective of total awakeness versus what it looks like to us schlubs? But at the end of the day, Alexandra, you're absolutely right. There's no difference, because all of dualistic experience is made by that totally awake, aware, wisdom, virtuous, benevolent, living subject. And there's so many consequences that flow from that understanding. The first of which being is if you really grok it and you have at least some glimpses into that experientially, you can lighten up. Right? You can lighten up about your issues and your problems and everyone else's problems and our problems, as a planet. You can just lighten up about that, still feel compassion and all those things, but not so much earnestness and heaviness.
It seems like it removes kind of a hierarchy where like something, the absolute is better than the relative.
There is no hierarchy. There's absolutely no hierarchy. So the tantric traditions, or the direct realization traditions, having this view that everything is equal and that there's a plane of existence, not a ladder or hierarchy, a plane. Also said that women should be able to practice, and working class or poor people should be able to practice, and outcasts should be able to practice. The very practical outflows from this worldview.